Shipwreck at the Bottom of the World, the extraordinary true story of Shackleton and the Endurance. Chapter 5, Winter on the Pack. The pack had closed around Endurance. In the words of Orderlies, they were stuck like an almond in the middle of a chocolate bar. With the ship locked in the ice, there really wasn't much the crew could do. The forecastle hands, the sailors whose job it was to run the ship, had no sailing to do. Worsley had no captaining to do. But the rest of the men found ways to keep busy. Hurley climbed into the frozen rigging and took scores of photographs, amazing everyone with his fearlessness and yelling outrageous Australian curses just for fun. Green's job in the galley was one that never varied, no matter what, and he had the stowaway Black Barrel to help him. The crew needed to eat, whether the ship was moving or not. The scientists on board kept up with their experiments, such as they were. Reginald James, the physicist, tinkered with the ship's primitive radio. It was only a receiver, so they could not send news of their predicament, and even under the best conditions, the radio was barely capable of picking up a monthly signal from the Falkland Islands. But that never did come through. Even after James rigged up an extra length of antenna wire. Boreholes were drilled through the ice for surroundings and water samples. Some of the men tried to create some excitement for the biologist, Robert Clark, by putting some pieces of cooked spaghetti into one of his specimen bottles of ocean water. The closed-mouthed Scottish scientist never mentioned the incident. Hussey continued to take meteorological readings as the summer began to fade. On February 17th, the sun dipped below the horizon at midnight for the first time. The fall was approaching and winter was rushing in right behind it. As for Shackleton, the boss feared that the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition was fated to spend the winter on the ship. There was almost no hope of crossing the continent this year. Making the best of things, he took apart a walking stick made of whalebone disc threaded on a metal rod and used those as poker chips. Card playing became a regular routine. Not that Shackleton had completely given up hope of escaping from the picture and caption on page 25. Frank Hurley, taking photos from high in the rigging, stands bare and hair waving in the wind, where we are gloved and helmeted. He snaps his snap or wins his handle, turning out curses of delight and pictures of life by the fathom, reported Worsley. To escape from the icy prison, the engines were kept stoked and watches were set to scan the horizon for any open leads of water. If there was any chance of breaking free, the boss wanted to be ready for it, and he was burning half a ton of coal a day to keep the engines fired. But by March 16th, winter on the ice seemed inevitable. Shackleton ordered the fires to be burned down. The men all knew what that meant. They were stuck until the ice broke up in the spring. They were all confident that their Norwegian-built ship, with her thick hull, could withstand being locked in the ice. Shackleton's only serious concern at that point was that the ship would drift far off course with the moving ice pack, causing even more delay. There was nothing to do but make the best of it and pray that they didn't die from sheer boredom. There was hunting to be done, of course. Now that the trip was delayed by a minimum of several months, the ship's stores had been supplemented with fresh meat. In February and early March, there had been plenty of life on the ice. There were seals and penguins in every direction. By late March and early April, game was growing scarcer as the animals migrated north, fleeing the onset of Antarctic winter. Daily hunting parties brought in a large store of meat and blubber for the bitter cold ahead. It was pitifully easy to kill the seals. They had no fear of anything on land, and the men could ski or walk up to the trusting animals and club them to death. Worsley manned the crow's nest by binoculars and megaphone and a flag, searching the ice pack for seals and then shouting and pointing out the seals to the hunters. At the same time, he kept a lookout for killer whales, which nosed up through cracks in the ice. The picture and caption on page 26, Charles Green, the ship's cook, carving up a seal for meat on board Endurance. The doctors on board guessed correctly that seal meat is anti-scorbic, prevents scurvy, and encouraged everyone to eat it as often as possible. Picture and caption on page 27. Herbert Hudson holds 2 emperor penguin chicks. Penguins have no land predators and are not afraid of people, making them easy to catch. Page 28. In order to make the ship's food stores last as long as possible, Shackleton was determined to feed the crew on seal meat, but not everyone approved of the plan. There was some grumbling about seal being only fit for dogs, but the men soon got used to it, especially when it was served as a succulent roast with onions and potatoes. The hunters brought the big seals back to the ships on dog sleds. Without questions, the dogs were the most dependable source of entertainment. Many of them lived in kennels built on deck by Old McNesh, the carpenter, but just for fun, some of the men also constructed dog glues on the ice beside the Endurance. The dog glue walls were made from blocks of ice, and the roofs were frozen boards of sealskin with snow piled on top. As the weeks went on, the men began to embellish the dog glues with architectural fantasies, adding church spires, minarets, porches, and domes. In spite of the grand accommodations, many of the dogs preferred to sleep outside their houses in the snow. Dogtown, beside the ship, was a noisy center of activity in the middle of a frozen sea, littered with seal bones and dog droppings. There were 6 dog teams for the overland journey to be made once Endurance got underway again. The drivers were James McElroy and Alexander Macklin, the 2 doctors, Frank Hurley, the photographer, Frank Wild, Shackleton's loyal second in command, Tom Crean, the Antarctic veteran, and George Marston, the expedition artist. The 6 drivers were ferocious in competition with each other, and when Hurley began to boast of having the fastest team, there was nothing to do but hold a race. On June 15th, all hands turned out for the Great Antarctic Dog Derby, held on a course called Epsom Downs after the famous racetrack in England. The caption and picture on page 28, some of the dog glues. And the caption and picture on page 29. Frank Wild with 2 of the dogs from his team. Many of the expedition's dogs were purchased with funds raised by English schools and were named in honor of their sponsors, Harrow, Rugby, and so forth. Other dogs had such names as Shakespeare, Sally, Wellington, Nelson, Shirley, Amundsen, and Sailor. Page 30. Betting with chocolate and cigarettes was heavy until someone broke out some gold souvenirs, and then the wagering turned downright feverish. The frenzied yelping and barking of the dogs was brassy in the frozen air. Nearby, a band of penguins, like an audience of formally dressed opera-goers, observed the proceedings. When the starter's gun was fired, the 910-pound sleds were off into the noon twilight on a 700-yard course, with shouts of mush, gee, and haw from the drivers. As the Aurora Australis flickered overhead, Wild came in the dog's whiskers ahead of Hurley, with a time of 2 minutes and 9 seconds. Groans of dismay and yells of triumph accompanied the exchange of loot. And it wasn't only the men that the competition was so hot. In spite of their regular sledging practice and exercise, the dogs themselves were still semi-wild beasts, and dogfights broke out constantly. Bites to dogs and men were common. Dr. Macklin developed a unique style of breaking up these fights. He simply punched the fighters in the head with his heavy, mitted fist. 1 or 2 blows were generally enough to send the fighters yelping into their dog glues. If the dogs spotted a penguin while on a sledging run, they would chase after it in spite of furious yells from the driver. The waddling penguins didn't stand a chance against the dogs. Under Shackleton's leadership, fighting never broke out among the men, even though they weren't exactly cut out to be buddies. The focal Souls' hands were worlds apart from university scientists, for instance. Many of the personalities of the men wouldn't have meshed even under the best circumstances, let alone cooped up on a ship with nothing to do and nowhere to go. The men couldn't go anywhere, but in fact the ship was moving. Ever since becoming stuck in ice, the ship had been steadily drifting north with the pack. The whole ice pack was moving in a clockwise direction, sweeping west and north with the current up along the Antarctic Peninsula. Whenever Worsley could get a good sighting from the sun or the stars, he calculated the ship's position on the charts. They were making steady progress toward the north, and they all knew that eventually the pack would break up as it reached the warmer waters. If they could just be patient, they knew they'd get out of this jam. The boss found ways of maintaining a routine in order to keep the crew from going crazy with cabin fever. Each week, every member of the crew, including dogs, was weighed and measured, and to see that no one was losing weight or eating too much. One night, surveying the bearded, shaggy castaways around him, Shackleton ordered haircuts for all. Worsley described the event. Rickson gloatedly seized the clippers and plies them till not a vestige. The picture and caption on page 30, dog teams leaving Endurance. The teams were harnessed up for training every other day, often wild rides, when the half-wolf dogs would tear off in pursuit of penguins. Page 32. Picture and caption, Frank Worsley left and Reginald James, the physicist, take astronomical sights at night to calculate the ship's position. Page 33. The picture and caption, the haircutting tournament provided a break from the routine and lots of laughs. Of longer hair than a bristle is left, and his victims looked like one of the Roman emperors. We all get clipped to a man and look like a group of convicts. The amateur barber seizes his victim with the air of a man about to do a mighty deed. He brandishes the clippers aloft. They descend, and a yell of protest arises from the unfortunate objects of his attentions. All now looks so irresistibly quaint, comical, and criminal that the camera is called in to perpetrate this event or this evening and to cure us, where necessary, of conceit of our personal appearances. Card playing, guessing games, impersonations, listening to gramophone records, slide lectures, reading aloud. The men found ways of entertaining themselves and kept their thoughts occupied in the long, dark winter months. Worsley gave a lecture of New Zealand and taught several volunteers the Maori dance, the haka. There was a singing contest to determine the worst singer, and the votes overwhelmingly went to the boss. They even held mock trials, such as the one where Worsley was accused of stealing a trouser button from the offering plate of the Presbyterian Church. The skipper was found guilty, of course, much to the delight of the focal hands. Arguments arose between the FAFs, the Fresh Air Friends, who wanted a hatch open, and the FUGs, the Fetid Undergrounds, who argued against letting out the heat. On June 18th, Dr. McElroy suddenly discovered that he had brought his dice along, and betting with the Rattlers became a popular game. Every Saturday night in the Ritz, as the common room of the ship was known, a ration of grog was issued to all hands. The toast, as always, was, "To our sweethearts and wives, may they never meet." Shackleton made sure that the ship's routine was always followed. Breakfast, which always consisted of porridge, cocoa or tea, bread, butter, and jam, was served at 9 in the morning. Lunch of soup, bread and jam, and cocoa was served at 1 p.m. Tea was at 4, and dinner, the most substantial meal of the day, was at 6 p.m. In between meals, there were ship's chores to do, such as cleaning the decks and common rooms, bringing ice on board too. The caption and picture on page 34, midwinter dinner, June 22nd, 1915. Picture and caption on page 35. Feeding the dogs in Dogtown in the dark of winter, June 3rd, 1915. The dogs were fed 1 pound of raw meat daily. Dr. Macklin described the routine. At 5 p.m., there was a shout of dog wallas, followed by terrific barking by the dogs. It is feeding time. Often there is fighting, and the driver has to freely use his whip or feet or fist to prevent their damaging each other. For when these animals get their grips, they show no mercy to each other. Page 36. Melt into drinking water and rubbed the eyes spouts off of the 2 tons of potatoes stored in the hold.